If you're approaching retirement and you're doing it on your own, a lot of questions are going to come up. But a lot of conversations start the same way, and it's usually not something along the lines of when should I start withdrawing from my RSPs or when is the best time to take CPP. It's something more like, am I going to be okay doing this on my own? And there's usually a bit of a pause after that because what they're really getting at is if something does go wrong, is there enough here to absorb it? Because if I make a mistake, there's no built-in sounding board sitting across the kitchen table from me. There's no one else there to help smooth things out. So let's go over an example. I was speaking with someone recently, and we'll call her Bev. She was in her early 60s, had done really well for herself, and was getting pretty close to retirement. And for Bev, it came back to the same thing. Am I going to be okay doing this on my own? And it's a fair question because when it's just you, there's less room for things to be off. Now, where this tends to show up is in the starting point for the plan. A lot of people will say, well, I'm one person, so I probably need about half of what a couple would need, which sounds reasonable, but what tends to happen is that people build a plan around that and it ends up being tighter than they expected. Because if we just take a step back for a second, a lot of those bigger costs don't really scale down to one person the way people expect them to. Your housing costs are still going to be your housing costs. Property taxes are still going to be there whether you're single or married. And you see the same thing happen when someone becomes widowed. Their expenses don't get cut in half because a lot of the fixed costs are still there. So what ends up happening is that expenses are not usually 50% of what a couple would spend. It's closer to 65, 70, sometimes even 75%. And that's where things tend to get a bit tighter when it's just you because now you're covering those same expenses on one income. And with Bev, this is exactly what we walked through. She came in with a number in mind, and on the surface, her number made sense. She was looking at a friend of hers who was married, had similar savings, and was living a similar lifestyle. And she was using that as her reference point. But the part that wasn't obvious is how different that actually plays out. Because there's two incomes there. There's income splitting opportunities, and there's just more flexibility built into the plan. So even though the starting point looked the same and was very similar, the plan underneath it wasn't. And once we adjusted for that, her number was higher than she expected, and it changed how the plan needed to pull income. Not dramatically, but enough that it changed how we needed to think about her retirement. And this is kind of where things shift a bit, because it's not just about how much you need, it's also how that income actually shows up. And this is another spot where it starts to look a bit different when it's one person versus two. For a single person, everything ends up on one tax return. There's no real way to smooth that out. So even if the income looks similar to a couple, the tax outcome will likely be worse. So now the question becomes, how do you actually structure things in a way that keeps that under control? Because you can't change the tax rates, but you do have some control over when you take income and where you take it from. And this is where things like the TFSA start to matter a lot more. When you're single, having that bucket that doesn't hit your tax return is priceless because it gives you flexibility. Now on the RSP side, this is where people can get caught. Let's take a simple example. Let's say you retire at 61 and you really don't touch your RSP early on. Everything stays invested, keeps growing. And then eventually you're forced to start taking it out later. Now, instead of pulling, say, 40 or 50,000 a year in your 60s, you might be forced to take 80 or $90,000 a year out in your 70s. And all of that is fully taxable. So what tends to happen is people end up pushing that income further into the future and then pay more tax on it when they finally take it because they didn't take enough out earlier and there's no spouse to split that income with. So really what you're trying to do is just smooth that income out over time. So with Bev, this was a big part of the conversation. Not what she owned in her accounts, but how we were actually going to draw it down. Because the difference between doing that intentionally and just letting it happen ends up being a meaningful difference in tax over a 20 to 25 year retirement. And this is also where CPP starts to matter more, because a lot of people think about CPP as a timing decision. Do I take it at 60, 65, or 70? But when it's just you, it's a bit different. Because in a couple, there's usually some level of built-in backup. There's two income streams, a bit more flexibility if one piece of the plan doesn't go the way you expected. When it's just you though, that's not really there. So CPP isn't just about when should I take it, it's really your base level of guaranteed income for life. And once you start to look at it that way, the decision changes a bit. Because early on, the instinct is usually to take it sooner because it feels like you're getting something back after years of making contributions. But if you look at it differently, then another question comes up. What do you want your income to look like at 75, 80, or 85? Because that's where CPP really starts to matter. If you take it early, you've got a bit more flexibility in your early 60s. If you delay it, you're giving up some income early, but you're locking in a higher guaranteed amount later. And when there's no second income to fall back on, that guaranteed piece starts to matter a lot more. Because Bev's biggest fear in retirement was to end up with a low income with no support. So again, it's not just a timing decision. It's how much certainty do you want built into the later part of your retirement? And for a single retiree, that piece carries a bit more weight. Now, if you're curious what these numbers look like for your specific situation, the CPP timing, the tax picture, the withdrawal strategy, book a call using the link in the description. Most of what we've talked about so far has been on the constraint side of things, and that's very real. But there is another side to this that doesn't get talked about as much. Because when it's just you, there's only one decision maker. There's no back and forth, no trying to get two people comfortable with the decision at the same time. If something needs to change, you just make the change. And I see this show up a lot when things move. So markets are going to shift, spending changes, something unexpected comes up, you're tired of maintaining a yard and you want to sell the house. As a single retiree, these changes happen a lot quicker. And over time, that actually matters because a good retirement plan isn't static, it needs to evolve. And when you're the only one making decisions, that tends to happen a bit more cleanly. And with Bev, this was part of the shift as well. Once she saw how everything fit together, it wasn't about trying to match someone else's plan. It was about building something that worked for her and adjusting it as she goes. So again, there are some trade-offs to retiring single, but there are also some advantages if you actually use them. But what really matters is what happens when something doesn't go according to plan, because it usually won't. Markets won't cooperate in a straight line, spending won't stay perfectly consistent, life just doesn't work that way. And when it's just you, there's a bit more pressure on the plan to absorb that, because there's no second income to fall back on, no one else to offset it. So when we start putting a plan together, this is where we start asking, what happens if markets drop early? What happens if spending runs a bit higher? What happens if you live longer than expected? And again, with Bev, this was an important part of it because on the base case, things looked fine. But once we ran through those scenarios, we were able to make a few small adjustments that made the plan a lot more stable because there's a difference between a plan that works and one that actually holds up. So going back to Bev's original question, am I going to be okay doing this on my own? The answer was yes, but not because nothing could go wrong. It was because the plan was built with that in mind. Now, one of the decisions we covered today was CPP timing. And for a single retiree, that decision carries more weight than almost anything else in the plan. If you want to go deeper on exactly how that works, then check out this next video.